Hello, welcome back. This is Dr. Burton. This will be the last installment on my Nietzsche quotes. I can tell people are getting bored with my Nietzsche quotes, but here's why I'm paying attention to Nietzsche. Someone asked me on Facebook, why pay attention to Nietzsche? He's a nobody. He's not a real philosopher. Nobody reads him. I beg to differ. I think a lot of people have read Nietzsche, and a lot of people even though they may not take him seriously as like an analytic philosopher, have imbibed in his spirit, let's say. So here's an argument about why I'm spending time on Nietzsche. And to be honest with you, I once thought this too. He's a nobody, he's not a philosopher, but as I looked at his ideas, I see that they are influential and they ought to be taken seriously, and he's a good challenge for us. He challenges us to be more conscious and consistent. So here's my argument for dealing with Nietzsche. The modern period in philosophy brought a crisis for epistemology, starting with Descartes. That's my major premise. The modern period in philosophy brought a crisis for epistemology, how we know things. Minor premise, Nietzsche is at the end of the modern period. And conclusion, Nietzsche is at the peak of the crisis for epistemology. He is the one that clarifies this crisis, crystallizes it for us. I think Nietzsche sees this crisis very, very clearly. He expresses it explicitly. He anticipates the new philosophers of the future that are coming, and he tells us about them. And he is the granddaddy of postmodernism and critical theory. And I even suggest he influenced some of the analytic philosophers through the Vienna Circle. If you want to know how I think he influences all three strains of contemporary philosophy, you can read chapter 4 of my book, Retrieving Knowledge. So, if we do not address the epistemological errors of the modern period and its post-Nietzschean offspring, we will end up, as Nietzsche did, in self-destruction. Not just individual self-destruction, but cultural self-destruction. And that's why I focus on Nietzsche. I think he's given us the clearest picture of the problem and the implications. If we follow out a certain philosophy logically, then we'll end up in a bad place. And I don't want us to end up in a bad place. I love doing philosophy. I think his line of thinking leads to the death of philosophy. And I make that case in my book. You can check it out. But I'm going to do a couple more quotes, and then we'll kind of pull it together. One of the errors, I think, of the modern period is empiricism. All of our knowledge is through the senses. Now, there's a moderate kind of empiricism that maybe was taken for granted by John Locke, and then it gets played out by David Hume, and it's shown that it'll lead to skepticism. All of our knowledge is through the senses. The senses don't deliver us anything for sure, so we can't really have knowledge, certainty. I'm just thinking of a series that my friend Owen Anderson is doing on David Hume. You can go check out his videos on Hume. But that empiricist idea, the moderate empiricist idea, continues to develop and is critiqued by the end of the analytic school of philosophy. Quine critiques it, and it is also critiqued by Nietzsche and carries over into the continental school. It's also critiqued, I think, a little bit by the pragmatists. I argue that all three of these strains of philosophy, because of the skepticism it leads to, ends up in pragmatism, that we just need to do what works. And I think some people are arguing out there that critical theory goes hand in hand with pragmatism. I don't know. I'll let you think about that. Let's look at Twilight of the Idols. A few quotes. I don't want to make it too long today. With the highest respect, I accept the name Heraclitus. So Nietzsche is going to identify with Heraclitus. When the rest of the philosophic folk rejected the testimony of the senses, because they showed multiplicity and change. He rejected their testimony because they showed things as if they had permanence and unity. So Heraclitus too did the senses an injustice. They lie neither in the way the Eleatics believed, nor as he believed. They do not lie at all. So the senses don't lie to us. What we make of their testimony, that alone introduces the lie. So we receive data from the constant change in the world. Heraclitus was a proponent of the flux doctrine. All of matter is in constant motion and is in change. Our senses tell us so, and the senses don't lie about that change. But what we make of the testimony of our senses, that's where problems come in. That's what introduces lies. So our interpretation of what comes to the senses is a lie. Now, what I want to point out is he is right in pointing out there's a distinction between what the senses deliver and our interpretation of what they deliver. And some interpretations of what we perceive happen to be false. So far, I agree. For example, the lie of unity, the lie of thinghood, of substance, of permanence. Okay, now we get into some problems. So he's saying we don't experience unity. We don't experience thinghood or being. We don't experience substance, matter, spirit. We don't experience permanence. So since we don't experience those things, and we think about those things, they must be fictions. Notice the assumption, though. Everything has to come from experience. Those things don't come from experience, so they are not true. I think that's the problem, and he's going to attribute it to reason. Reason is the cause of our falsification of the testimony of the senses. Pause. Is reason falsifying the senses, or is reason the very tool that we use to interpret the information we take in through our senses? This is unavoidable. Now, we could have a bad interpretation, granted. Insofar as the senses show becoming, passing away, and change, they do not lie. Why? How do we know that? How do we know the difference between a lie and the truth? That's not something the senses tell us. But I digress. But Heraclitus will remain eternally right. Eternal truth. Thought we didn't have those. Heraclitus will remain eternally right with his assertion that being is an empty fiction. So there's no being, only becoming. Why should I believe that? Why should I believe the testimony of my senses? Actually, my senses, I don't believe even the flux. The apparent world is the only one. The true world is merely added by a lie. So he's making a distinction between appearance and reality. On what basis do you make that distinction, if not by reason? That's not a distinction the senses tell you about. So he's rejecting reason and things we can't sense, but he's using it to make this distinction. So I don't think we should give him a pass on that. The apparent world is the only one. Why? Prove it. And the true world is merely added by a lie. So what we call true is a fiction again. Next quote. Today we possess science precisely to the extent to which we have decided to accept the testimony of the senses, to the extent to which we sharpen them further, arm them, and have learned to think them through. Think our senses through. The rest is miscarriage and not yet science. In other words, metaphysics, theology, psychology, epistemology, or formal science, a doctrine of signs, such as logic, and that applied logic which is called mathematics. In them, reality is not encountered at all, not even as a problem, no more than the question of the values of such a sign convention as logic. So notice he's making the distinction between what the senses deliver and science connected to the testimony of the senses. We'll put that over here. empiricism, and a miscarriage of not yet science, which means not yet through the empiricist method. And what falls over here is metaphysics, theology, psychology, epistemology, and logic. Because logic is, at least in the Aristotelian sense, claiming to be about reality. So these are things we can't know empirically, and so they are fictions. But why should we accept this empiricism? Why should we say, yeah, all of our knowledge is through the senses? That is what the pre-Socratics said. That's what the Eleatics said. That's what Heraclitus went with. And that's what led to deep skepticism. We can't have certainty about anything. And that's what gave rise to the sophists and their pragmatism. That's exactly what we see today. Except I don't think the critical theorists are going to let them get away with just being pragmatic, because they want justice, they want activism in the world, and there's a kind of objective truth needed to have justice. So critical theory might be bringing us back to truth, even though it's making us question the truth of everything. Anyway, the assumption here is that empiricism is the way to go in epistemology, and I'm going to suggest empiricism is the very thing that's wrong with epistemology in the modern period. Okay, let's do a couple more quotes here. The prejudice of reason forces us to posit unity, identity, permanence, substance, cause, thinghood, being. We see ourselves somehow caught in error, compelled into error. So because the senses can't tell us about these things, they're an error. But why should we accept that? Why not say, no, rather the error is that we should know these things by the senses. Not everything should be gotten by the senses. This is a long discussion in the history of philosophy that we just have written off when we took philosophy to be almost restarting with Nietzsche. So I'm not going to accept the empiricism. Okay, let's do this quote. Everywhere, reason sees a doer doing, a person, a self, a soul. It believes in will as the cause. It believes in the ego as being, in the ego as substance, and it projects this faith in the ego substance upon all things. Only thereby does it first create the concept of thing. Everywhere being is projected by thought, pushed underneath as the cause. The concept of being follows and is a derivative of the concept of ego. In the beginning, there is that great calamity of an error that the will is something which is effective, that the will is a capacity. Today we know that it is only a word. Notice this. There's a denial of even a self that does anything. Why is that? Because if everything in the natural world is flux and motion and change, then the self also is flux and motion and change. It's not a being that has a unity and continuity in time. It's also part of the flux and flow. So we have almost self-created ourselves. What is it that's doing that, though? Can matter self-create itself? In terms of a self, I'm talking, not as in terms of atoms. So we create ourselves, and then this self creates the world. But it's a fiction. So this is an idea that seems to be behind this notion of self-creation, self-fashioning, very much a part of critical theory or popular thinking in critical theory, where we can say whatever we want to say about ourselves. Our gender is self-created. Our uniqueness is self-created. So I think this is an underlying idea. When you deny being, you deny a self, then we are myth makers. And we're myth makers about our own identity as well. Identity is self-created. So I think this is there behind some of the popular critical theory that we're seeing. Now, this is my favorite quote by Nietzsche ever, and I want to connect it to the next video I make. So it begins this way. Reason in language. Oh, what an old deceptive female she is. I am afraid we are not rid of God because we still have faith in grammar. This is a good one. So he's basically saying reason is deceptive. And notice this is, I don't know, sexist language. I'm okay with it because he's, a product of his time, but, and he had female problems. But notice he's saying reason lies to us. Reason's a liar. You can't trust it. Why? Because it's making fictions. And it's reason in our language. So our words connected to the world is the deception from other quotes we've had. And he says, I'm afraid we as a culture, society, as human beings, we're not rid of God. So God is still lingering in culture. Even though God is dead, he's still lingering in the fabric of culture because we still have faith in grammar. Think about what that means. Language, reason, language, grammar. What is the connection? Reason is the order of our words and our world, and grammar is the order of our language. And if you believe in order, then there must be this connection to belief in an order maker, God. And there is this sort of intuition that we have that maybe when I say we, that philosophers have had, that if there's an order in the world and there's an order in my mind and there's a connection between this order, that order has an origin somewhere. And I argue that that's how philosophy begins, in this search for the logos in the world, the logos in my mind. How is that order there? Why is it there? What's the origin of it? And philosophy is the search for that order. And now Nietzsche is saying there is no order in the world. There is no order in our mind. This is a deceptive thing, and it's a tool for navigating the world because there's no order. So he denies any order, and he denies God as an order giver. So there's no isomorphism between reason and being. There is no God. We are in nature, a product of nature, trying to make sense of nature. But because we had God as part of our fiction, that fiction remains in our culture, in the fabric of our culture, in the very belief in grammar, because grammar's an order. So we're imposing this order, and the story is the order, I guess, is divine, because God is the word. He spoke using language, the creation into the world. He breathed life into Adam, and Adam became a living being and a speaking being. So language, reason, language, grammar are part of the fabric of reality in the previous theistic worldview that Nietzsche is denying, saying is a fiction. So we need to do a revaluation of values and get rid of the old values. Part of the old values would include reason, language, and grammar. Now you might think that's high-level philosophy stuff, Dr. Burton. Okay, how does that have to do with anything we're seeing in culture right now? Well, I'm going to show you one of the things I read this week that I think is a popular way of expressing this quote, and a popular way of dismantling the old values in the culture. Have you ever heard of decolonizing the university? What is that? Decolonizing the university is a very popular thing right now in the academy. I think we're going to look at it next. So I'm going to pause here. Today we talked about, there's more quotes we can go over, but I think we've gotten enough to see that Nietzsche is going to separate reason from being, and language and grammar, and give us this epistemology that goes into radical empiricism. Okay, so the modern period begins with moderate empiricism. Nietzsche takes the assumptions that are being worked out, takes them to a more consistent level, to radical empiricism, and this is the end result of radical empiricism. I'm suggesting we are the grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Nietzsche's epistemology. I will pause here. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for persevering through these 4 Nietzsche episodes, and I hope it was helpful. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.